Today we're going to continue to discuss chrysanthemum, and I'm back on the chrysanthemum tea. It seems like every time I study it for a while I realize that I should be drinking this stuff regularly. I know that some of you have gone to Tensung Trading Company, you've let me know. You've looked for chrysanthemum. A couple of you had trouble actually finding it. So when you're looking for it, this is what you'll want to look for, is a brick of chrysanthemum tea like this. It's wrapped in paper, and then has this twine. So it's kind of a primitive kind of packing method. And this was $13. And my recommendation is to let it get warm in your house, like up to at least 70 degrees. Put it in a Ziploc bag and then put it in the freezer, and that'll kill any worms that may have hitchhiked along with the tea. Because oftentimes when you have the tea for a long time, you'll open it up and you'll see the little holes that different small insects have made living in the tea there. It smells very good. So today I want to talk, first a little bit just about the chrysanthemum in general. So the word chrysanthemum comes from the Greek root chrysos, which means gold, and anthemum, which means flower. It's kind of a golden flower. And I have a couple of chrysanthemums here that were just growing in my yard. I picked them before coming in to give this lecture. These are just two different varieties, but they both have this kind of yellow, kind of golden color to them. For the Chinese, the character for gold Jin is gold, but it also means more broadly metal. So Jin, which means gold, means metal, and this quality, this metal quality or phase, is associated with autumn. Qiu. With autumn, with the fall. So in Chinese medicine, there are various different ways of organizing elements of the cosmos into categories. Probably the most common category that you're familiar with would be like yin and yang. So things that are cool and dark and wet are more yin. Things that are hot and dry and more active are more yang. Bright are more yang. But another system of kind of organizing or understanding the cosmos are the five elements, what are referred to as elements, but really they're better translated as phases. Let's see here. There it is. So Wu is 5, and then Xing, this Xing here, is a phase or an element. So oftentimes you may have heard of the 5 elements in Chinese cosmology. Earth, which produces metal, which produces water, which produces wood, which produces fire, which in turn produces earth. So it forms this kind of cycle. And that system of the 5 phases is very prominent in the early Chinese medical classics. So in the Yellow Emperor's classic, for instance, in chapter 5, the Yin Yang Yin Xiang Lun, the correspondences of the treatise of the correspondences of yin and yang, there are a number of chapters that deal with each of the elements in turn. And the chrysanthemum is the flower that, at least in common, in Chinese culture and whatnot, is most closely associated with the fall. So the 9th month, when autumn's sort of at its height, that's when they have the chrysanthemums being presented everywhere. They would drink a chrysanthemum wine on the 9th day of the 9th month as a way to kind of get the body in accord with the cycle of the seasons, in a sense. But it's worth, in understanding the physiological effects of the chrysanthemum from a Chinese medical perspective, it's worth looking at the phase of metal, the metal phase, because the chrysanthemum very much it has very much an affinity with that phase, and the way that it's used is to kind of, in many respects, to sort of strengthen that phase in the body. So I keep saying phase instead of element. That's this character, Xing. I just want to show a little bit about the etymology of this character, Xing. So Xing here, which is often translated as phase or element, it actually shows a foot on the right and a foot on the left. So two feet going. So sort of a way of going. Like, you know, if you were to walk with 2 feet, there'd be a right and a left. When you think about it that way, it does in some ways kind of, it evokes an image of a frequency. So when you have a frequency, you have a movement to one side and then a movement to the other, a movement to one side and movement to the other, this kind of vibration. And for the Chinese, the metal phase, it wasn't just metal, it was also a sound. So there were specific notes in a scale that could be used that would have a metal phase to it. As a matter of fact, in early warcraft and spy technology during the Warring States period, one technique, and I have no idea if this was in any way efficacious, but it was something that they believed at the time. One technique that they would use, the spies would approach the enemy encampment, and they would have a set of bamboo cylinders that would each resonate with a different frequency, which would resonate with the frequency of earth, metal, water, wood, fire, and they would place them in the ground to kind of absorb the vibration of the enemy encampment. And then they would listen very carefully at each of the tubes to see which of them was vibrating the most from the encampment. And based on that, they would know what sort of phase the enemy was in, if they were in a metal phase or a water phase or a wood phase. And then they could use a corresponding element in their strategy to attempt to attack the enemy. So if they were kind of in a wood phase, if the enemy was in a wood phase, they might use tactics that were more akin to kind of the fire phase. But I thought I might just read a little bit from the chapter 5 of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, just to give you kind of the scope of things that are all comprised in this metal phase. But it starts with a directionality. It says, Xi Fang Sheng Cao. The western direction generates dryness. So the points of the compass were also associated with the different phases. In the west, where the sun sets, that was associated with metal. East, where the sun rises, was associated with spring and with wood. And then the sun at its height, but the south, was associated with fire. And the north, where the sun is weakest, was associated with water. And the central region was associated with earth. But in this kind of description of the metal element, it first starts with that directionality with the west. And it says that the west generates dryness. Dryness generates metal. Metal generates the pungent flavor or pungency. Pungency creates or gives birth to the lungs. The lungs generate or give birth to the skin and the hairs of the skin. This seems sort of strange, but the skin and the hairs of the skin, so the body hair, generates the kidneys, and the lungs rule the nose. And it goes on to say, in the heavens, in meteorology, in the sky, it is dryness. So the meteorological kind of influence in the sky was dryness. And when I think about autumn, personally, growing up in Michigan, it really was a dry time. You know, the summers would be very humid, and then in the fall, everything would get dry. The leaves would dry on the trees. They would form all these beautiful colors and you know, have this kind of crispy, crunchy, you know, sort of a metallic look to them. And I just remember those kind of crisp, cold fall mornings, and the kind of excitement, the kind of electricity in the air from that dry weather. But here in Oregon, it's also the herald of rain, so it's sort of hard to associate that kind of dryness with the fall there. But in any case, it says, yes, in the heavens it's dryness, in the earth it's metal, it's jin. So somehow this notion of dryness up in the air is related to metals in the earth, or metal, the kind of metallic property in the earth. Yes, and on the body, it's the skin and the body hair. Amongst the organs, it's the lungs. In terms of color, it's the color white. And in terms of sounds, it's the shang, the note shang. So these notes, historians today have attempted to kind of recreate this scale system. And I think that some have managed to do it to some degree of fidelity, so they can actually, you know, play these 5 notes and get different effects from them. But the early Chinese physician could very well have used, you know, this system of notes to, you know, treat the body or diagnose the body. So, and in terms of sheng, in terms of sounds made by the human being, it is crying. And in terms of physiological or pathological changes, it is coughing. Amongst the orifices, it is the nose. Amongst flavors, it is the pungent flavor. Yeah, and then it goes on with that. So that gives us a context from the early Chinese medical classics. You know, kind of where we would expect the chrysanthemum, you know, to fall. It's this plant that somehow embodies this ability to, I want to say, like, restrain or confine or bring the yang energy back into the body. So during the summertime, the yang energy, and this is talked about quite a bit in the early chapters of Dr. Liu's book. In the spring, the yang energy is released, and then during the summer, it's sort of given free rein. There's all this activity. But then in the fall, there's an active process of receiving and storing and subduing that kind of yang energy. If you think about, in terms of sort of personalities, the wood personality is exuberant, speaks very loudly, almost in a kind of shouting way. There's a lot of activity, and like in the springtime, when there's so many things to do, there's this kind of attention deficit, kind of a hyperactivity, and excitement to everything. So starting a lot of things, but not finishing anything, and maybe not achieving a lot of kind of merit or mastery in any one thing. But the metal personality is more focused on a single thing. It's very precise. It does a lot of, you know, kind of practicing over and over, and it takes those skills and really puts them into a form that has real value. If you think about wood grows, you know, literally on trees. It grows everywhere, and there's a lot of it. It takes a lot of activity to kind of get the value out of wood. Whereas metal is refined and it's in the earth. You can have a small amount of it, and it can be very valuable. It's lasting and whatnot. So that ability to, if you think about the summer, the element that's associated with summer is fire. And if you think about kind of fire in the body, as maybe also being, in some cases, at least in terms of pathology, being, you know, the type of inflammation that we've talked about in previous lectures, then this fall energy of the chrysanthemum has this ability to, you know, restrain or contain that kind of fire energy. What I think is interesting about chrysanthemum, especially, you know, kind of drinking chrysanthemum tea, is it has this bitter taste to it. It's slightly bitter, and that has a drying element to it that really does make you want to drink more of this, you know, this elixir here. And then you have here this kind of golden color to the chrysanthemum, which fits, you know, the color of this liquid kind of fits with the, I guess, the doctrine of signatures there, but with its correlate in the kind of metal element there. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the, well, today I wanted to focus on the bioactive ingredients in chrysanthemum. And one of them is luteolin, which is one of the sources of that yellow color that's in the chrysanthemum tea there. So luteolin is it was used as a yellow dye, and you can derive it from various different plant sources. But it's also much of what you're seeing here in this decoction. Some of the yellow color is going to come from the beta carotene, from the vitamin A that I've discussed in earlier lectures. But this particular biomolecule, luteolin, is a little more focused in its activity than vitamin A, which is used, you know, variously throughout the body. But it's primarily it primarily acts as a modulator of skin aging and inflammation. And I don't know if you remember when we looked at the Shenlong Bansao Jing, the second herb that's mentioned in the Divine Farmer's essential materia medica is chrysanthemum. It's the you know, it's the second one that is written about there. And one of the things that it is used to treat is the pifu, siji, the skin becoming kind of dead or dried up and dead, like you know, like a withered muscle or something like that. So, but this sort of drying up and withering of the skin and the muscles, which you would think about as happening during the fall. You know, if you think about the fall, that's when the skin tends to get dry. If you look at the plants out in the world, all the leaves kind of dry up and crinkle up and whatnot. But chrysanthemum flowers in the fall, and it has this ability to counter a lot of that kind of dryness and whatnot. So the luteolin that's in the plant itself, it acts as a way for the plant to be able to absorb ultraviolet radiation. So it helps to protect the flowers, you know, from kind of burning or being damaged by the radiation that they're exposed to throughout the day. But they also, luteolin suppresses a wide range of inflammatory modulators. This is a host of the interleukin, interleukin 1, 6, 8, 17, 22 are all inhibited by luteolin. And it also interferes with tumor necrosis factor alpha and other immune modulating cytokines. So if there's inflammation in the body for whatever reason, drinking chrysanthemum tea, the luteolin that's in there will help to dampen and modulate that inflammation. And furthermore, it helps to regulate the nuclear factor kappa light chain B activating, or the NFK the NFKB pathway in the cell, which is a crucial part of inflammation, both during a disease process, say an acute infection, and the sort of inflammation that happens and occurs over time. So this notion of, as it's written here, the skin becoming kind of the skin and muscles becoming withered and dry, that relates to, and I think in many respects, to the interference with this NF-κB pathway. So as we age, as we grow older, one of the things that happens is our skin begins to age, but our muscles also begin to shrink and atrophy over time, and that is very much mediated by this this inflammatory pathway. So it's not just the luteolin that has an effect on that. The other biomolecule that whose behavior is less broad but that has a stronger effect on this inflammatory pathway is the one that I mentioned last week, handling. This is that juhua lactone. This is a glycoside that interferes with the NF-κB pathway in the cell. So I don't want to just keep referring to that NF-κB pathway without giving you some way to kind of picture it. Essentially, inside the cell, inside every cell, and it's not just human cells, it's every animal cell in the animal kingdom, there is a mechanism by which inflammation and or even apoptosis can and that is this NF-κB pathway. So there are these cell messengers or signals outside, and these could be anything from, it could be a heavy metal, it could be oxidative stress, it could be viral or bacterial elements that are out there. Those, once they're detected by immune cells, cause certain cell messengers to be released. Those cell messengers then bind with the receptor on the surface of the cell, and this initiates a cascade of events, which ultimately causes part of this the two parts of this NF-κB molecule to move into the nucleus of the cell, where the DNA is. And once they're in the cell, then they interact with these particular areas on the DNA to produce an mRNA, which then leaves the nucleus, travels to the ribosomes, which are these kind of they're organelles, but they're where proteins are generated in the cell, and this will then create the inflammatory the molecules, the cytokines that promote and create inflammation in the body. So that's all mediated by this NF-κB, this nuclear factor kappa light chain B activated molecule. So both the luteolin and the handling are shown to interfere with this process. So let's say you have just a common cold, or you have the flu. Part of a large amount, say, of your symptoms are actually generated by your own body dealing with the illness. So up to a point, of course, this is very good. You want the body to respond to the viral insult, but after a certain point, it becomes extremely uncomfortable, as anyone who's been sick knows, and you're really looking for relief. And it can also become dangerous. This exuberance of the inflammatory response can get out of control, and then your body's response to it, of course, can become far worse than the disease itself. If you think about acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the way that people in 1918 died from the flu, and it's also the way that people, in our current era are, dying when they contract COVID. That acute respiratory distress syndrome is the body's own kind of disorganized, innate immune response to a viral insult. So the body is able to detect that there are viral elements there in the tissue, but because the virus is so unfamiliar to us, we don't have any antibodies that can help to dampen the virus and help to direct the immune response towards a humoral type of response, which causes far less inflammation and damage to the infected tissues. So instead, the tissues become very inflamed, and they can then it can cause widespread tissue death, and in the case of the lungs, which are supposed to remain dry, it can cause fluids to leak into the lungs, blood and other transidates to enter into the pleural space, to enter into not the pleural space, into the lungs, and fill up the alveolar sacs and whatnot. And at that point, the person can no longer get enough oxygen, and ultimately even assisted respiration and whatnot is unable to keep them alive. Now, I'm not saying that drinking chrysanthemum tea if you're coming down with COVID is an appropriate measure, and in fact, nothing that I'm talking about in this lecture should be construed as medical advice. But it is true that the luteolin and the handolin that are in chrysanthemum tea will dampen the inflammatory effects that you see there, and because they're very weak and they're very mild, they are, I think, best suited to like a low-grade type of inflammation that we might see, especially in old age. So one of the effects that inflammation has as we age is the effect on the brain. So what I think a lot of people may or may not realize is the types of plaques and the deterioration in our neural tissue in the central nervous system that occurs as we age. A lot of that has to do with like kind of long-term inflammation, and then the death of neural tissue as a result of that inflammation. And then, of course, when cells die, there are a special type of immune cell that's in the brain called the microglia, and they just kind of hang out. They have all these long arms and whatnot, and they're constantly monitoring the physiological environment in the brain. When they detect that there's anything wrong with the cell, or if there's any kind of antigenic material that makes its way into the brain, makes its way past the blood-brain barrier, these microglia are able to detect that, and they will then engulf. They will, consume that material. It could be whole cells, or it could be, particular proteins and whatnot. They'll consume it, and after they've consumed a certain amount, they actually stop being active as microglial cells, and they become what are called glitter cells. They just kind of hang out in the tissue there, and these cells, along with other plaques that are formed, other amyloid plaques that are formed in the brain as a result of unresolved inflammation or unresolved metabolic pathways, over time cause a simplification of the neural pathways in the brain and lead to senile dementia, which will affect all of us if we live long enough. We will see the effects of that, but there are a number of things that we can do, of course, to help to stave that off and help to prevent the effects of dementia. And one of those would be the foods that we eat and drink and consume. And chrysanthemum, as it turns out, has a number of things in it that can kind of help us in old age. Can kind of really help us to shine. Which, when you think about the chrysanthemum flower, these amazing sort of blooms that emerge very late in the year when all of the other flowers have given up and they're not doing anything, and then you have these elaborate rich, the splendor of the chrysanthemum that presents itself there to the world. It's not hard to understand how the Chinese associated that flower with particular kind of character traits in people. So one of the things that the Chinese esteemed was, and they still do, it's still esteemed in Chinese culture today, is these kind of talents or the sort of mastery that can be accumulated over time, and that really only kind of comes into its full power with age, as we become older. So one thing that I love about Chinese culture, and one of the first things that I experienced as a student of different Chinese arts, everything from I've dabbled in Tai Chi and Chinese brush painting and whatnot, but then especially in acupuncture and medicine, these teachers that are older, they're in their 70s, their 80s, their 90s. Here in the United States, in the medical field and whatnot, they're sort of over the hill. It's like time for them to retire. They're like a professor emeritus somewhere, but they're really they're not at the top of their game in our culture. And when it comes to artists and whatnot, it's always like the young kind of innovator who's doing something totally new and different and shocking and whatnot here in the West. But in China, what I found was the people that were given the greatest respect and admiration were the older people. So I had a research fellowship after I graduated from Reed to look at traditional Chinese art in the Chinese diaspora communities of New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then I made my way over to China. But in all of those communities, the kind of the central nodes of the cultural continuity in the community were these elders, these people that were in their 70s or 80s, who had been painting all their lives, and their skill just kind of continued to build over time. And one of the things that was esteemed was I don't want to call it the loss of skill, but the flavor that would emerge from their painting as they got older. So they would build up this ability to recreate things perfectly and make these perfect brushstrokes. But then as they grew older, their work would take on these kind of their own kind of individual characteristics that were very closely associated with their particular personality, and that's what made their art really beautiful. And it was real. It wasn't just like, oh, they're getting sloppy. It wasn't a sloppiness that emerged. It was like a real kind of flavor that kind of came from it, and it was often referred to as like in Malaysia they would call it like han la. It's like very like hot and kind of spicy. But that spicy, that la flavor is this shin flavor. This flavor, which is shin, which is the flavor of the chrysanthemum, or one of its flavors anyway, is that kind of that element, which is associated with metal and associated with the fall. So I want to keep talking about the kind of health-giving effects of that chrysanthemum offers, not just to the lungs, but to us as we age. So Chrysanthemum indicum is one of the subspecies of chrysanthemum that's been highly studied, and Chrysanthemum indicum extract was proven both in vitro and in vivo to help prevent osteoporosis. And it did this in one major way. The major way that it helped prevent osteoporosis was by inhibiting or decreasing osteoclastic activity. So our bones, all of the time, our bones are being broken down by cells called osteoclasts, and they're being built up by cells called osteoblasts. So when we're in a sympathetic state, when we're up and about, we just got up in the morning, we've had our coffee, it's finally kicking in, it's 10 o'clock, and it's finally kicking in, we're driving, you feel totally alert, you have all this energy, you're in a slightly sympathetic state, and your body actually starts to break down your bones during that state. It will start to take minerals, calcium and other minerals from your bones, and use them in circulation for all these metabolic activities, for this range of activity that we're engaged in. Then later on in the evening, when we start to relax and we have a nice meal in us, and maybe we have a glass of wine or something like that, our bodies, on net, our bodies start to repair and actually start to build bone. So the osteoblastic activity becomes greater. This Chrysanthemum indicum extract was shown to reduce osteoclastic activity. So it actually reduced the amount that our bodies were resorbing bone to free up minerals and whatnot. So in that sense, it kind of fit with the element of fall, of autumn, which is this receiving, this storing, this kind of packing away of wealth and resources that occurs in the body, that kind of fall element. Whereas the breakdown of bone material in order to get the minerals that we use in our various kind of metabolic activities during the sympathetic state, that looks more like the kind of element of spring, where everyone is kind of going out and doing a lot of stuff. So the Shenong Bansao Jing, one of the things, one of the key features of this herb that it talks about is it says that it's Ju Fu Li Shui Qi. Taking it over a long period of time, it benefits, it profits, it increases the blood and the qi, and then it Qing Shen, it lightens the body. Nai Lao, it kind of staves off aging, and it Yan Nian, and it extends the years. So not only does the chrysanthemum tea kind of help to prevent the kind of diffuse inflammation that causes our muscles to wither over time, and it causes our brains to become less healthy and to have fewer kind of possible pathways, but it actually kind of strengthens our bones. The bones in the body are seen to be the kind of purview of the kidneys. The kidneys are the storage in the body, and they're associated with winter. But the segue into winter, this absorbing of the minerals and whatnot, and the storing away of the minerals in terms of osteoblastic activity, that's the realm of the of fall, and that's where chrysanthemum is working. The breakdown of the bones, the freeing up of the yin of these materials that have been stored in order to engage in activity, in order to kind of make a fire during the summertime. That's the spring. That's the spring impulse. So the chrysanthemum manages to preserve this kind of vitality of spring and summer. It manages to preserve it by encouraging the body to kind of restrain that kind of exuberant activity, to not have there be so much osteoclastic activity that the bones become weak. It kind of puts the brakes on it. It inhibits that sort of activity and whatnot. Maybe focuses, in a way, kind of focuses our energy so that we're not trying to do lots of different things at once. I keep talking about this Shenong Bansao Jing. I have on my wall here, I have this this painting. This was actually a painting. It was kind of hard to see with the lights. That might be a little better. But it has this was like it says on the back, China 2000 BC, Shenong, legendary founder and patriot god of Chinese pharmacy, is said to have tested herbs on himself and written the Bansao, the first classification of drug plants. So this was, I'll put my glasses on, I can read the description a little better here. This was Pharmacy in Pictures. There was a series of these. There was one for Egypt. There was one for, I can't remember the various civilizations, but I picked this one up. I found it at an antique store or something. But it shows, here we have Shennong here with his, I don't know, this is some sort of like fur cape that he has on there. And then he has his assistant here. His assistant is holding some ephedra, and he has ginseng, rhubarb. He has various different herbs here. And then he has this mortar and pestle and his kind of woven basket with lizards and things like that. But he's tasting these herbs, and he's somehow determining what they were good for. Now I'm not suggesting that there really was a kind of like a proto-mythological figure named Shennong who went through and tested all these herbs on himself. Supposedly he died from liver failure, at a fairly young age, because he was testing everything, including different poisonous mushrooms and stuff, which after a while will kill you. But I do believe that the early practitioners of Chinese medicine tasted these herbs and tested these herbs on themselves, and could feel where what effect these herbs had on their bodies, and which meridians they entered, kind of what they did to the human body. This is something that Dr. Liu actually talks about quite a bit in the first third of his book. He talks about how nowadays, and much of the information that I have about chrysanthemum in terms of its bioactive components, I learned found out about by looking at journal articles. So what do? They have a laboratory out there where they have, oftentimes it's animal subjects, and they will isolate this particular compound, give it to the animal subjects, and then look at changes in their histology in their tissue, or look at changes over time in their physiology and whatnot. And based on that, they can determine what these particular constituents do. But the early Chinese medical practitioner did conduct experiments, but they conducted what Dr. Liu refers to as subjective experiments. So rather than create this big laboratory with all this stuff and have to you have to do all these kind of, and I'm not poo-pooing the Western medical endeavor or science. I think it's fantastic that all that's happening, and there's just a huge wealth of information that's come from Western science. But the Chinese medicine practitioner would make a decoction of the herb, and then drink some of it, and then if they were very aware of themselves, they would be able to tell what effect it was having on the body, and then based on that, they could easily kind of prescribe things. And I think we do that all the time, as human beings. Like, we know, you start coming down with a cold, and you just start, if you have any sense about you, you are drawn towards certain foods that you want to eat. You might want warm tea or warm soup, and you almost know what it's going to do to you. You almost know you're going to put pepper on your soup, and you're going to have your chicken soup, and then you're going to get sleepy. You're going to get in bed, and you're going to sweat. And no scientific journal needed to tell you that. You just know it from your own experience. And the same is true kind of across the board. When you're feeling a certain way, you will crave certain things. Oftentimes those things that you're craving have a particular physiological effect. And humans are perverse. We may crave the very thing that will make us sicker or will put us into a further state of imbalance. But the medical practitioner who was attempting to create a greater balance in the body would have kind of trained their instincts and their understanding to select to know which kind of herbs or substances could be paired up with their particular state and could kind of help to balance out what was going on in the body. So that kind of balancing of forces in the body is something that is kind of discussed or touched on in the chapter that I cited earlier from the Yellow Emperor's Classic. So these seemingly separate facets of the cosmos, crying, dryness, the lungs, the skin and hair on the body, these things which seem like unrelated, in the Chinese mind are related. Somehow the dryness in the air and the metal in the earth they're kind of the same thing as the Western direction. They're all kind of a similar energy that's appearing in the cosmos in these various forms, but is at its heart is all kind of the same thing. And you could call it the West, or you could call it metal, but it's this phase, this kind of frequency, in the body there. Kind of a long. I wanted to talk about one other element of the chrysanthemum in terms of its effect on the body, and it also relates back to a line in the Shenong Bancao Jing, because the first thing that it says, the very first two characters in this description are zhi feng tou, and then that's immediately followed by tou xuan, which is the head is xuan. Let's see. So it's first to be used for swelling and pain, and that's this kind of, this inflammatory process that we talked about. Everything from the kind of styes that you can get on your eyes, where you can apply the chrysanthemum and it can reduce the pain and swelling that's there. But it can also be used for toshan. To is like the head, and xuan is the eyes, and then this kind of dark color, but it means like to be like muddle-headed or confused or foggy-headed. This sort of brain fog is how I think about this toshan, this kind of brain fog. And that brain fog, when you think about it, it's kind of like the brain just not being very kind of active or alert or whatnot. Chrysanthemum contains this biomolecule called thuyon. Many of you, if you're familiar with it, you may be familiar with it from wormwood, from absinthe. So this was the psychoactive component in. Has anyone ever had absinthe or heard? It was made illegal back in the day, and it was first made illegal. There were a lot of political and kind of commercial interests that, of course, contributed to it being made illegal. But the discovery that it contained thuyon, and the fact that thuyon, when given to animals at concentrated dosages, or if humans were to ingest it in concentrated dosages, it would create seizures, not necessarily epileptic, but it would cause convulsions and seizures. That's one of the main reasons why absinthe was made illegal. So thuyon is also very much present in your chrysanthemum tea, and it has the effect. It has a stimulating and mood lifting effect. So it interacts with the gamma aminobutyric acid system in the brain, and it has sort of an opposite effect to alcohol on the brain. So when you drink alcohol, the kind of cloudiness and confusion that can occur when you've had one too many, thuyon would have the exact opposite effect to that. So it would cause your brain to become kind of clearer. Everything would be crisper and sharper in a way. And in drinking chrysanthemum, I've definitely it could be psychosomatic, of course, but I certainly noticed that effect. It doesn't rev me up the way that caffeine does, but it definitely makes me more alert and kind of sharper and more kind of on it, I guess. Just able to see things more clearly or think about them for longer periods of time without kind of losing my train of thought. I guess we're out of time here. I know I wandered around a little bit in all these lectures, but hopefully you've gained newfound love or you just reestablished your love and respect for chrysanthemum tea. And I really do encourage you to buy some and have it in your house and drink it from time to time. I think you're going to love it. And once you're familiar with it, it kind of becomes like an old friend. You don't have to hang out with it every day, but there are times when you'll just be craving it. When you are, I greatly encourage you to make yourself a glass and drink it.